Thank you, Mira. We come now to the keynote addresses, the first of whom will be Professor Shlomo Avineri. Professor Avineri doesn't really need an introduction for Israelis, but since this forum is not entirely Israeli, let me say a few words as introducing his lecture. Professor Shlomo Avineri is well known in Israel and worldwide as a prominent intellectual and doyen of political scientists. His field of specialization is political philosophy, concentrating on Marx and Hegel. Based at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, his scholarly activities spread to many academic centers throughout the world. His analysis of current issues has covered a wide range of contemporary issues, from the collapse of the Soviet Union to the Arab Spring. Professor Avineri's diplomatic activities, as it has already been mentioned, include serving as Director General of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. He has been awarded many honors and awards, including the Israel Prize. Avineri published more than a dozen books, many of which were translated into several languages. I am honored and delighted to invite Professor Avineri to deliver his.
Good evening. Thank you very much, Professor Shamir, for this very generous and exaggerated introduction, but everything you said was true, so I can live with that. Thank you very much. But let me start with a question which I'm sure some of you may be asking: what am I doing here? Because I'm not an expert on Egypt. I do not know Arabic except some very basic street language. I've never studied Egypt or never studied Arab nationalism. And I feel really privileged to have been invited here, mainly because Tel Aviv University decided to invite somebody from the other place. We're not always used to do it in Jerusalem, so I'm grateful. And I also feel humbled. I feel humbled because I'm going to speak with my colleague and friend, Saad-Eddin Ibrahim. Most of what I know about Egypt is by having listened to him and read him. So I really feel very grateful for this opportunity. And one of the issues which I'd like to raise is, and it has been mentioned earlier, to try to put some of the questions which the workshop and the organizers have asked of themselves in a wider comparative context. Because we have seen in the last few decades a number of developments, some of them far away, Latin America, but some of them closer and more and studied in greater detail in Central and Eastern Europe. We have seen the disintegration of empires, Soviet Empire, the disintegration of a system, the Soviet communist system, attempts at democratization. Some of them have been successful, some of them less so. And when the Arab Spring started, the obvious analogy was to what was been happening in Central Eastern Europe, and perhaps even the word Arab Spring suggested a memory of what has been happening in Europe, 1848, the Spring of Nations. And we are today perhaps a little wiser and sadder, both with relation to Eastern Europe and also in relationship to what's happening in our region. And I'd like to suggest a number of insights, I hope, which have been brought up by comparative sociologists and political sciences. Our Jerusalem colleague, Shmuel Eisenstadt, Sam Huntington, Juan Linz, who tried to look on a comparative level, but with insight into the history and traditions of various societies, both of the potentialities and successes and sometimes failures. I know the organizers have started with 1919. I'd like to go a little bit back for a moment to something that at that time was viewed as a first attempt of reassertion of Egyptian identity and even nationalism, and this is 1882 Orabi Pasha. And I'd like to quote from a comment made by a European living at that time in London, who wrote about it the following. He was writing to a colleague. It seems to me that in the Egyptian affair, you are defending the so-called National Party too much. We know very little about Arabi, he says Arabi, not Arabi, about Arabi, but I am prepared to wage 10 to 1 that he is an ordinary pasha who does not want to let the financiers collect the taxes because he, in good Oriental fashion, would like to prefer to put it in his own pocket. It is again the eternal dilemma of peasant societies from Ireland to Russia, from Asia Minor to Egypt. Repudiating the Khedive's debts is, of course, perfectly all right. But the question is, what next? I think we can well be on the side of the oppressed Fellaheen without sharing their illusions and be against the English brutalities without at the same time siding with the military adversaries of the moment. This rather Orientalist, so to speak, approach has been expressed by Friedrich Engels in a letter to Edward Bernstein, which suggests that developments which apparently should have received unqualified support and enthusiasm among European Democrats, liberals, socialists, created at that time a little bit of questioning and a little bit of skepticism. And I'd like to relate to some of those issues that have to do with this skepticism. And again, what has been happening in Central and Eastern Europe may be a key, with all due respect to the differences and with all due respect that we should not make facile analogies. I'm sure most of us remember that when the Soviet Union collapsed, there was not only triumphalism in the West among both political scientists and philosophers and certainly politicians, but there was almost a messianic feeling, which was expressed perhaps in the most extreme way by an American philosopher, sociologist, Francis Fukuyama, the end of history. And some of us at that time were a little bit questioning it, and the question was, is it the end of history, or is there perhaps, in many cases, a burden of history, which may sometimes lead back to history, as Uzi Rabi has suggested in the title of his book, but there is a burden of history. And it is this burden that I'd like perhaps to address. The lesson that we have learned from Central Eastern Europe, which I'd like, with due respect, to relate in a moment to Egypt, is that the question of transition to democracy cannot be just judged by the language of those who are leading the revolutions, the rebellions, the demonstrations. There is also a CNN effect. When we see 1 million people or 500,000 people at Tahrir Square, we think that this is Egypt, and many of us have been greatly encouraged by it. But this is just one sliver of Egyptian society. And one can learn that when you want to ask yourself 20 years after the collapse of the communist system, what is perhaps the best predictor about the way a certain country will go, you will find out that it's very difficult to follow criteria which are easily quantifiable, like income per capita, degree of industrialization, of urbanization. Because in 1990, most of those countries, they were not really identical politically and socially or economically, because the Soviet Union was obviously not Poland, and Czechoslovakia was obviously not Hungary, but they had a lot of things in common. There was a one-party state, with the party, the hegemonic party, having a monopoly over political power. The economy was mainly, with some nuances, nationalized. the state party, had control not only about politics, but also about the media, about education, certainly control, if not oppression, of church or religious organizations. So the countries were very similar. Today they're very, very different. Poland is very different from Russia. Russia is different from Ukraine. And Hungary is different from Czech Republic. And the one predictor which has to be looked very, very carefully, and is now looked more carefully than before, is the power and the existence of civil society. In societies or in countries where there have been not only democratic tradition, with the exception of Czechoslovakia, in none of those countries there was a functioning democracy before the advent of communism. But there were traditions of civil society in countries like Poland and Hungary and the Czech Republic, were traditions of representative estates, medieval estates, not democratic estates, but still representative organs. There was an autonomy of city. There was a tradition of burgher autonomy. There was an autonomy of the churches. There was an autonomy of the universities. In those countries where those elements of civil society existed, even not always very strongly, because we know that before 1939, with the exception of Czechoslovakia, all of those countries, Poland and Hungary and Romania, were one way or another authoritarian semi-fascist dictatorship, but there were those traditions. It was easy, relatively speaking, to revive those traditions, even if some of those traditions were a little bit constructed and were presented stronger than they really had been, but they were there. In countries like Russia, there was a lack of this kind of civil society. If there are traditions of modernization in Russia, and there have been traditions of modernization, they have been the traditions of an authoritarian modernization, Peter the Great. Not an accident that in one of the previous offices of Vladimir Putin, there is a huge portrait of Peter the Great, a modernizer who tried to bring Russia closer to Europe, but in a very authoritarian way, which really put an end to the autonomy of the aristocracy, to the relative autonomy of the Russian Orthodox Church, and created a very hierarchical, pyramidal society, which was really modern Tsarism, which is part of reform. This is not a medieval Tsar, this is part of a modernizing reform. And this brings me straight to the Egyptian case. Egypt is very unique in the Arab world, and one doesn't have to say it because everybody knows it. It is a country with a very strong history of state organization. Egypt is perhaps one of the oldest countries in the world, with a state tradition that has survived, if you wish, from Pharaonic, Hellenistic, and then, of course, Islamic periods. This is not a country which was set up by British or French imperialists during Sykes-Picot. And this, of course, makes Egypt today very different in its ability to continue as an integrated country. It's not going to split up. This is not Iraq or Syria or Sudan or Libya or Yemen, countries whose political entity as body politics is a modern concoction, in many cases imposed by Western imperialists who tried to create Westphalian nation states in the post-Ottoman space. Egypt is very different. And this is, of course, one of the great pluses of Egypt and its ability to maintain an identity, despite the fact that there is a Coptic minority, a Coptic group, which is still part, in a very integral way, of Egyptian society. On the other hand, this state tradition has a problematic impact on the processes of democratization, because there is a very strong state. And this strong state can, in what can be called in a very glib way, and I use it in the title of my lecture, a Pharaonic tradition of a very hierarchical, pyramidal structure, which is used by whoever is at the top of the political pyramid. So what is a great achievement for Egypt, the historical state structure, a strong state structure, may be also an impediment when it comes to democratization and liberalization. The second issue has to do with the fact and this is something which people like Shmuel Eisenstadt worked on it and published, that modernization has very different ways of appearing in different historical societies. We all know that modernization in Egypt can be dated back to Muhammad Ali. But we also know that the one institution which was modernized first and modernized relatively successfully compared to other spheres of society was the army. And the Egyptian army has been the bearer of modernization, and therefore also Arabi Pasha has to do with the tradition of the army being identified to a very strong way with a nation and with a national identity, something which came out, of course, during the Tahrir demonstrations when the army and the people are hand in hand. I mean, this is something which goes very deep in Egyptian society. Now, when this is part of tradition, this has to be taken into account when you deal with democratization. Is it that easy to dismantle a tradition which, in the context of modernization, has created modern Egypt? And of course, during the 1952 revolution and later, became the mainstay of what was then called Arab socialism. And the other issue has to do with civil society. There has been, and again, I'm not speaking as an expert, but as somebody looking at from the outside and having read some of the material that was published then, we all know that the Muslim Brotherhood under Mubarak, and before that, and of course, during its brutal suppression by Abdel Nasser, and later, has been banned as a political party. And this created the image when the Muslim Brotherhood, the Ikhwan, entered the political scene in during the Arab Spring era, that, well, yes, of course, this is an element in society, but it has been politically suppressed and is very weak. And this was, to my mind, one of the reasons why the prognosis of many observers when it came to election was that, yes, Muslim Brotherhood will participate, it should participate as part of society, but basically it is just one element in society. What was perhaps overlooked was that despite the fact that the Ikhwan were suppressed as a political party, organizations like some of the professional organizations from doctors and journalists and writers, which in a corporate Egyptian tradition had an impact on society, have been in the years prior to 2011 or 2012 headed by people who were close or even members or even directly connected with the Muslim Brotherhood. That welfare organizations, when it came to issues like fighting alcoholism, dealing with delinquent youth, dealing with prostitution, organizations linked to the Ikhwan did sometimes a much better work than the state bureaucracy, which wasn't always very successful or very keen in dealing with those issues because it had other priorities. In other words, when next to the army is a very strong historical institution identified with the nation, and as an Israeli, it may not be very easy for me to say it, after 1973, an army that gave back to Egypt some of the national pride which was lost in 1967, a very important element in Egyptian national consciousness. Next to this, that the strongest civil society organization in Egypt was ultimately the Muslim Brotherhood. And if the civil society, the strongest association, is some organization with the ideology, authoritarian, religious, like the Muslim Brotherhood, if this is the strongest element in civil society, next to the army as one of the strongest institutions of that society, the chances for a pluralistic, liberal, democratic transition is very much between the Scylla and Charybdis of those two institutions. There were people who believed, and I can see why, that the Muslim Brotherhood, when it entered the political arena with elections to the presidency, to parliament, despite the fact that they eventually said they're not going to challenge the presidency, or run for the presidency. When you look at the way in which the Muslim Brotherhood has participated in those elections, they adopted democracy. An American president embraced the Muslim Brotherhood in a way because they adopted democracy. But their understanding, and some of us who were exposed in various conferences in Europe and otherwise to spokesmen of the Muslim Brotherhood at the time when they had a parliamentary majority, at the time under President Moshe, heard a very specific understanding of democracy, a purely majoritarian understanding of democracy. So democracy is the rule of the majority, and we are now a majority. You in the minority, you can contest the elections next time. For the time being, we are legitimate in a democratic way. Now, this is a very politically interesting way of viewing democracy, not as liberal democracy, but what as people like Orban, the Prime Minister of Hungary, is calling illiberal democracy. That democracy is just about majority rule, not about minority rights. Now, between the army and the Muslim Brotherhood, the chances of the emergence of a true liberal, democratic, voluntary, pluralistic civil society is problematic, to which you can add one of the paradoxes of the situation, that when General Sisi, as he then was, started his coup and went on TV, next to him, one of the people supporting him was the Coptic Pope. Because for the Coptic community in Egypt, having to make a choice, which was obviously a very difficult choice for many of them, between an authoritarian military dictatorship and a fundamentalist, quasi-totalitarian, religious, majoritarian Muslim Brotherhood, not an easy choice. And they made the choice, as made some of the younger people who demonstrated against Mubarak and found themselves at the end fearing much more the Muslim Brotherhood than a potential alternative military dictator. So the question is, where does one go from here? And this is what I think Dayan will tell us. But one has to realize that when it comes to transitions from authoritarian governments, it is relatively easy to bring them down. 2011, 2012 was very unique in the Arab world because for the first time something happened here which didn't happen before. I remember when communist regimes came down 1989, 1990, and authoritarian regimes came down in Latin America, in Indonesia, in the Philippines, and nothing happened in the Arab world. There were people who said, no, the Arab world is different, it's not going to happen here. This is nonsense. It did happen in the Arab world. It did happen in the Arab world with the Arab Spring. But bringing down authoritarian regimes is one thing. You can do it by demonstrations. You can do it by violence. But creating a functioning democracy is something that all of us should realize is a very long process. The French Revolution didn't establish French democracy on a sure footing. It took perhaps a century and a half. The United States, with the wonderful language of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, wasn't able to put an end to slavery before a civil war. And even today, the issue is not yet settled. So it is a long way. And the question is to try not to be taken in by the sloganeering, which is helpful, not by the momentary attempt to bring down dictators, but institutional building. And the question, and we see it in other Arab countries where the state is problematic because it's a new concoction. In Egypt, it's different. How do you create institutions based on pluralism, on tolerance, on accepting the views of others not as being just treason or being agents of foreign powers, something which I think we hear we have heard in the last few days from Tehran. Creating those institutions, especially creating those institutions in a country which is still, as Egypt, traditional, Muslim, not Islamicist, but Muslim. How do you use religion, which views itself as speaking in the name of a divine sovereignty? How do you create it being based on popular sovereignty, not on a majoritarian way, but in a pluralistic way? So is there a way out of the present situation in Egypt? I think it is, but it will take time. And we have to realize that things that happened as then, again, I want to underline it, they took decades, if not centuries in Europe, cannot happen overnight. But the question is there a way transforming authoritarian, even military regimes into something less oppressive, something more pluralistic, and something more open to change and accepting the view of the other? Because one of the problems of democratic transition is that people have to learn with tolerating people whom you do not like. And tolerance, we have the same problem in Israel occasionally. I mean, tolerance comes from tolerate, which means to suffer. Sovlanut v'sevel. I mean, even in all language. I mean, you have to be tolerant to somebody with whom you basically disagree. And this is a great challenge to all societies, and I think it's a challenge that will be tested again and again in the Egyptian case. Thank you very much.